Good evening, everybody. My name is Doug Mitchell. I have the great pleasure of serving as the executive director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy, the park's official nonprofit partner. And I am so happy to be back with you in 2025 for another year of the Glacier Book Club. With your support and encouragement, starting in all of our basements in 2020, we've created really something very special, and I'm just so honored to be a part of it. And speaking of special, tonight we're really honored to welcome back author, educator, ethnohistorian, filmmaker, tribal consultant, community collaborator, the amazing Dr. Sally Thompson to the Glacier Book Club. She was with us to talk about her first book, one of our very first authors, and an early adopter of the Glacier Book Club. We have over 100 people registered from around the country tonight. And Sally, we are just so excited to have you back tonight to talk about Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo, which was published just last year by our friends at Far Country Press. Sally, thanks again for coming and being with us.
Well, thank you for calling on me again. And Doug, I was remembering when you called the first time and I said, oh, I really don't like online anything. I don't think this will be a good fit for me. And you convinced me that I should try, and you made it so comfortable. So this time I've just been looking forward to it. Thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really a treat again to have you with us. And again, and people, as people know, the first book that we talked about, People Before the Park, remains the bestseller for the Glacier Conservancy in the park's bookstores, which we operate on behalf of Glacier National Park. And where the profits from all those sales go back to work in the park. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. I'm joined tonight by the best team in the business: Gracie Regala, Andrew Smith, Amy Lucky. Amy is going to moderate the chat. So if you have a question for Sally, start right now, type them in there, put them in the chat. And Amy will get to as many questions as we can, because we really want this to be a conversation between you and Sally. I'll get us started with a few items of curiosity that I have, but really we want to pass this on to you so that you have the opportunity to talk firsthand to this amazing scholar, author, and friend of the Conservancy. So, Sally, I want to start a little bit with your background. Professionally, you moved to Missoula after earning your PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago.
Colorado.
Oh, pardon me. Somewhere around 1980, and really you've never looked back. Walk us through how a kid from Denver goes from being a self-acclaimed Aspen ski bum to a world-renowned anthropologist and author.
Well, I don't know if that's accurate, but I was laughing thinking about this history. I was looking at a picture of myself as a 3.5, 4-year-old in my little cowgirl boots and a little cowgirl skirt, and with my aunt and brothers on the trail to the grave site of Buffalo Bill. Never, he was a hero. And then to learn, that he killed over 4,000 buffalo himself. And, just a funny thing that as a little kid, I'm doing that reverently, going to this grave. And then exposed to the idea of people of the past, but through archaeological remains at next to a cabin where we used to go when I was just very young, like 4 and 5, 6 years old. And I just can even remember standing in this meadow where the woman who owned the cabin was talking to me about these artifacts and the people that used to live there. And in a way, that thread was always there, I think, this interest in what we don't see. And that's manifested in my life in a lot of different ways, not just in the early career of digging under the ground. And then when I was, I think maybe early college, a movie called Soldier Blue came out. I don't know if any of you ever saw it. Buffy St. Marie sang the theme song, and it was about the Sand Creek Massacre. And I was sitting in a theater in Denver, having grown up there and never, ever having heard that all of these Cheyenne and Arapaho people had been slaughtered in their homeland. They're on the plains, not that far from Denver. And I'm usually not an emotional person. I couldn't leave. I was sobbing so hard. And, something about that just stuck with me and has really been kind of a driving force that people ought to know whose homeland we live in and how to better know that life and what we can learn there and how we can all do a better job with, people who could have lived in the same homeland for so long and then in such a short time being annihilated. The original territorial governor of Colorado, his goal was to drive every Indian out of the state, out of the territory, and almost succeeded. The Utes stayed in that corner of the southwestern part of the state. But yeah, I guess I just felt like this is not the right story to be telling.
Well, and I think it seems to me to be very consistent, the idea of digging deeper, right? First, there's the physical part of digging deeper in the soil, but also digging deeper. Did that surprise you? That's not the story we heard when we were kids. You and I are contemporaries, right? That's not the story we heard when we were kids. So you also had to unearth that story as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, so thinking about unearthing stories, I just finished another great book sent to me by one of our fellow book clubbers, Ed Wilson, which is by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And she and her late husband go through what you've just done, which is unpacking old boxes to find a story, right? You talk right at the beginning of the book about unpacking old research materials and binders. Tell us about kind of the emotion related to that, how that felt, and how it felt to go back and do that discovery all over again.
Well, it was a wonderful opportunity. I think I have been some people are really good at completing a project and then, carefully kind of sorting through before they put it away. And they draw better conclusions. And I am always just like barely putting it away while I'm running into the next project. And I've been that way all along. And so to stop and go through I had two 4-drawer file cabinets just jammed with research materials and then more downstairs. But these were the ones I worked with. Such an old-fashioned way to work now, but um, pulling those out and going through, at first it was just a cumbersome process. And then I started thinking I've got to be clearer about how I sort through. And I looked for the projects, the topics that weren't just maybe intellectually interesting, but the ones that really touched my heart. And of course, if in that case, there were relationships involved. It wasn't just artifacts or a book I found, but the person who helped me find the book or just relationships that I made through the years. So it was like a walk down memory lane and kind of just nostalgic, but it also made me I think take stock of what I had done in all those years where I just had never really done that. I don't recall I've gotten to work on some really amazing projects and do my part to help, and yeah, felt good.
Well, that must have been, there's a gratitude in that, I would think, right? That you're able to look back on, as we talked about, a 4-decade career dedicated to this work, and to look back because the stories, the 23 stories that you tell, and I'm sure there are many more in the filing cabinets, really do show the breadth of a really incredible career. If you had to pick maybe, if you had to pick 2 or 3 stories, you were going to go to a reading and you had to pick 2 or 3 stories. I know that's kind of like choosing between your kids, but which couple come to mind that you would make sure that you talked about?
Well, I find I shape it around the part of the state where I'm speaking because I want people to be able to relate to the stories. Um, the ones that sometimes, if it's a really general crowd from a statewide convention, that Maslow story always comes up. People are fascinated by that, and so am I. And it brings us up to the present and challenges in living in community. So it transcends a lot. Some of the stories are just more entertaining in a way. That one I think has a lot of meat.
Yeah, yeah. The Maslow one, and just a side question, I wonder if you note that Maslow really never wrote about his summer. Why do you think that was?
He wrote a draft manuscript with a student of his at the time. That tells me the fact that he had a grad student working on it. He was a busy professor, and here's my field notes, help me tell this story. And I don't know why it never went to publication. He'd been editing, you can see he typed it and then he was editing it, and maybe he turned it in and it was not accepted. I think Narcissus Blood, the person who told me about this to begin with, I think he learned that when Maslow sent them his original manuscript about the theory off to be published, he did include a part about the summer, or at least attributing the ideas to what he learned there among the Siksika. And the publishers chose not to include that part.
Interesting. Again,
Yeah.
sort of the selective telling of history, right? That again, you've helped uncover some of that. This is not easy work that you've been doing, and it's not easy even just if you were just a historian unearthing stories. But talk to us a little bit about the added complication when you're telling other people's stories, right? And it must be a fine line and take a lot of communication and thinking to make sure that you're doing this being culturally sensitive and appropriate to whose stories they are, sense of place and sense of people. Talk to us about how you grappled with that and thought through that, and talk to others about it as you chose to publish this book.
Well, some of those stories got put aside at the beginning, like I just would never tell them. The ones that made it into the book that were of a sensitive nature, the Kootenai oral history, their origin story, certainly highly sensitive to have other people telling that. So I'll start there. There are, I think, 3 that I grappled with. That one, I had worked quite a bit with a number of Kootenai people during the People Before the Park work, and have continued a friendship. And so I went to some of them and said, this is what I'd like to do. And we ended up, because a Tunaha man from, a Kootenai relative from BC had told it, and it was recorded with his permission and transcribed, that if I just stuck to that version and attributed it, that I could do that more safely than if I were going to be retelling somehow on my own. And my interpretation of that story as being actually connected to the glacial lake floods, all of that, I wanted them to read it and know they were comfortable with what I was doing with their story. So my colleagues from Elmo, met, and we talked over it a lot and talked about the word myth, and how to be sensitive about the common beliefs around myth being kind of a not true, and that they didn't want they didn't want that to come through, because for them there's a very deep and important truth in these early stories. And so, well, they suggested that I consult with a Tunaha historian, woman named Viola Birdstone she's from the Tunaha area, but she teaches in Vancouver, I think at UBC. So she reviewed it for me, and she suggested a few things that I change, which I did. And that made it okay. It doesn't mean that every Kootenai Tunaha person who reads it will say this is great. But I felt like I had, as Vi said, you've been very sensitive, and we appreciate it, and think it's important to tell. To have people think about the possibility that the Kootenays have been here in their world, they would say forever, since the beginning of time, since the time they incarnated. So it's a whole different way of thinking about the beginnings than people of a Judeo-Christian background. But just to imagine, even if it's just the fact that their beginnings go to the time when the glaciers receded and the land was habitable, they've been there since then. And archaeological evidence backs that up as well as their stories. And so I think they agreed with me that this was an important story to tell. The other ones that were difficult, the story about the Crazy Dog Society and their rattle. I would not have just published that without talking to some people from the Crazy Dog Society today and making sure they were comfortable with that coming out. So I got permission to use it. And the other one was the Somebody's Daughter, the burial here in Missoula that was repatriated to the Confederated Tribes. That had been a really difficult process, and I wanted to make sure that the coordinator of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Protection and Repatriation Act, that she was comfortable with the way I was telling it. And I'll have to say, actually, she was included much more in the story directly and named. And then toward the end, she said she didn't like the way I left out the difficulty in working with the university on that project. It was a struggle, and she felt like people should know the whole story. And I felt like what mattered was the work we did to return that child to a burial in the cemetery up in Dayton. So anyway, she has to be taken out of the story because of that. But we're still friends. It's okay. It all worked.
It's a very powerful story, and I think for me that story, and then also the story about the Badger too, really gives a really great sense of the depth of the work that you do, and you've brought the depth of the work and the depth of the thinking that is required and the challenge in it. And I just, I think I'm sure I speak for a lot of people on the phone on the Zoom, and I'm going to stop talking here because there are already a bunch of questions in the chat. But it's really extraordinary to have that shared out, and I really appreciate the courage to do it, because it wasn't easy, wasn't without controversy, right? And you could have easily just not done it. But these stories are special. They give us meaning as people about the community in which we live, the world in which we live. So thank you for having the courage to do that and to go back. Amy Lucky, I'm going to pass it over to you with just a couple of primers. We're going to give away a couple of books tonight. We're going to give away the book that was mentioned in chapter, I think it's 17, Andrew Garcia's book, Tough Trip Through Paradise, 1967. I've arranged to have that one shipped to a lucky winner. And then Sally wasn't busy enough with one book published last year, so she has a second, and we'll be talking about that a little later, and we'll be sending out a copy of Sally's newest book as well to a lucky winner, so 2 chances to win. Again, feel free to either unmute yourself or put questions in the chat. And with that, Amy Lucky, I'm going to hand it off to you, my friend.
I can't.
Okay, Amy, we can't hear you at the moment. There's a little dot on her microphone, Andrew. I don't know if and maybe I will maybe go to another, maybe I can go to another question, and then Amy, when you start talking, I'll hand it off to you. How about that? Perfect. All right. So I have to, pardon the technological glitch. I want to talk a little bit about the Lewis and Clark piece, and I think it's the chapter Moccasin Telegraph. Does that sound right? You kind of give us a different view of the Corps of Discovery. As I remember the chapter, the Corps of Discovery reports that they never saw Native people for a number of days, but certainly Native people saw them. And I guess I feel a bit like that when I'm in Glacier Park, right? I don't often see a bear but I'm pretty sure that bears often see me. Kind of think about for us, do you think Lewis and Clark felt that they were interlopers in someone else's environment? Or did they think maybe because of white exceptionalism that the environment was only what they saw?
You know, they met a number of people coming up the Missouri in before they got to the Mandan villages. So they were aware of this all being an inhabited land. And then they learned so much during that winter there about the tribes to expect along the way. They were particularly nervous about that area as they switched from what's now North Dakota into Montana. There was a band of Assiniboines referred to as the Red Devils, and they had been told that they were very aggressive. And you know, this is when the Canadians were already interacting with them in the fur trade, and there was a lot of tension going on because they were powerful at that time. And so they were on guard and, you know, always on alert. But, you know, they had a big group. And so I don't think they were very afraid. A well-armed big group of trained men, and one woman. Um, it's hard to say other than that they were very aware of indications that there were people, there had been people around. I mean, they were finding abandoned huts and structures all along the way. Um, Nothing that seemed very fresh until they got I'm kind of I think I'd be near where U Cross, where the American Prairie Center is. In that area, they started seeing pretty fresh evidence, and got, you know, they were on alert for sure. But people, they saw a dog, they saw a ball, they, you know, saw some teepee poles, fresh cut kind of poles. Um, and they determined, I think, that one village had been occupied maybe a week or 2 weeks before, I think they determined. And then that's it. That's part of the story that, and they saw some smoke up the river, up a tributary. And so then, you know, the story told is about the one held in the Assiniboine community about having their scouts see these people. And you just think about, they're not boat people. Nobody on the upper Missouri, you know, had watercrafts. They just weren't they were land people, not river people. And so to see all these boats and people hauling boats up the river, it must have been such an odd sight. You know, kind of like people seeing big ships come into the Atlantic coast, just something so odd. And so they were certainly being watched. And then, you know, a wonderful story that's held in their community and their oral history and passed down about you know, how diplomatic the consensus approach to figuring out what to do. You know, they took the matter to the elders who in a lodge in a circle talked it through, and people had different ideas, but they came to the consensus that as long as they weren't aggressive, and they were just passing through, that would be okay, but they needed to be on the alert. And if anything went awry, the you know, smoke signals would go out to go after them, and then they would have been killed. And then the word spread, you know, so that they could see the evidence as they traveled farther up the river, that they did see they saw smoke go up, and it was where they were told to release the signal up on Snake Butte as they passed out of their territory. So, you know, those are very savvy people who know, you know, how to defend their borders, and they were ready to, but they weren't going to cause trouble unnecessarily. So I love the story. And then, you know, just continuing up the river to continue to be watched by people. And I guess what was astonishing was just how little of those records have survived, and how fortunate it was to have, you know, found that the Assiniboines had kept their story so intact. And then, you know, through a fluke of a small reference in a book 100 years ago, to remember a Blackfeet woman's story about seeing them as well. So,
So
did I
many,
answer your question, Doug?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
Okay.
you. I'm going to try and do my best Amy Lucky impression. Amy joins us from Big Fork, and those of you who know Big Fork know it is internet challenged. So I have asked my dear friend Gina Bridgman if she might unmute herself because she's got a great question.
Well, thanks, Doug. My question, as I was reading the book, because I had my own answer for it, was if you could have visited or lived in any one of your chapters, which would it be? Maybe somebody you would like to have known in person rather than just through your book, or some experience.
Oh man, I feel like I have to think about that one. Um, Andrew Garcia really appeals to me, and it might be to have, yeah, been around in those days.
Certainly was a harrowing story.
And what an idiot, right? Yeah. I don't know. If I included this maybe in the acknowledgments that my my husband's barber, his last name is Garcia, and so John says to him one day, oh, notices he hadn't put it together that it's Garcia and Garcia, but he sees all these photographs on the wall, historic photographs. And he says, so is this Andrew Garcia? And then, oh, hey, are you related? And it's his great grandson, I think. And so so he told him about that I was doing this book, and there was part of it, a chapter on Garcia. And so the photographs we included in there, he let us use from the family collections, and things like that. Just it, made it so much more personal and beautiful photographs, and the connection made with him then through this, and had a lot of that kind of serendipity happen throughout the process.
That's very cool. And again, we're going to give away a copy of that book later this evening. I've got a question from Darby and Zach from Helena. Darby and Zach, by the way, I'm also in Helena today.
Hi,
Um,
Darby.
and
Hi, Zach.
their question is on page 86 in the book, you reference the Hellgate passes just west of Helena that the sailors traveled over on their way to the Lane Bull treaty negotiations. Can you expand on that? They're not familiar with that. We've never heard of Hellgate Pass immediately outside Helena, and our research only found references to Hellgate Canyon outside Missoula.
It was an old term because Hellgate Canyon itself is interesting because a lot of people think of it just as that narrow canyon between Missoula and Bonner, or even East Missoula in a way, depending. But in in the early days, it's my understanding anyway that Hellgate Canyon was considered all the way to Drummond. You go through a lot of canyon country up the Upper Clark Fork. And so really it was the Upper Clark Fork from Missoula to Drummond. And so then Hellgate Passes referred to the passes you could reach going up, past the Big Blackfoot, right? So then you got Priest Pass and Mullen Pass, and um, I think there was even another, but it's my understanding those are the ones that are being referred to by Hellgate passes.
I'm going to ask Dave Baylor. Dave has a comment and a question in the chat as well. Dave, can you unmute and talk to Sally for a minute?
Yeah, I loved your description of the attempt to avoid the SN1, and it reminded me of Jack Nisbet's book, Sources of the River, about David Thompson, and I learned a lot from that book. I hope what I learned was correct.
Oh,
But
he's great. That's a wonderful book.
good. So that was basically the question. I learned a lot about the tribes from the perspective of a white explorer, but as a geographer, I have a great affinity for Thompson. So
Well, what an unusual example of a kind of unjudging, like just accepting people and being interested in them and acknowledging their knowledge. He was unusual. And I think Jack did a great job of making sure he went to the communities where, where people had interacted with Thompson, and, very respectful there as well. So,
And his book on two books on David Douglas actually were also very illuminating. Now I know where the Douglas fir came from and the Douglas ground squirrel,
right.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
Thanks,
so
Sally.
if people didn't hear The Sources of the River by Jack Nisbet, highly recommended book.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Stacy. Amy's back, but lost the chat, so that we're really being nimble here at the Conservancy. My question is that Beth, you and I had the same question, and Beth's question is about Father de Smet and overland journeys, and Beth asks, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the impact of the integration of Christian beliefs into native beliefs. Smith must be kind of a complicated character.
Boy, that the new book, it started out as totally following de Smet through Indian country. That was my original intention. And I have been on his trail for a long time, even going to his hometown in Belgium. And yeah, I kind of laugh about our connection. My children got pretty tired of hearing about him, but a really complicated person. And I, think he was as much explorer and adventurer and, like in the 18th and 19th century, there were a lot of Europeans who were just idolized because they were adventurers who wrote their stories, and then other people got to have the vicarious pleasure of going around the world with them. And de Smet was one of those people. And I just, as I learned more and more, I was so surprised because I made a lot of assumptions about a missionary and what he was doing here. He spent very little time within the communities with the people. He was not a pastor by any means. He was a mission builder. He was a map. He had this completely fluke. Well, I always thought it was a fluke, and then later I think he might have orchestrated this, but he ended up on a boat on the Missouri with Nicolet, a Frenchman who was a cartographer in charge of mapping the entire Mississippi River system for the U.S. government. And Nicolet took him under his wing, de Smet, and taught him surveying and map making skills. And so he was out there on the ground, and then, ended up really influencing the maps used in the treaties and the land cession treaties, and a lot of controversy about that. But back to he didn't bring Christianity to these tribes, which was something I didn't know either when I started out. Iroquois fur trappers that came like 30 years before he did, some with David Thompson and some later, they had already really taught the people Catholic practices and beliefs, and de Smet and the missionaries then just really further elaborated and then made it more firmly established in the communities with schooling and regimentation, and worked very hard to try and break down the traditional seasonal round living, because it didn't work well with his view of a community that's in prayer together and raising food together. So yeah, interesting man and fascinating story.
No doubt, and very much part and kind of front of mind for a lot of visitors to the park who get on the de Smet, right? That's one of their first, for a lot of people, that's their first experience in the park at Lake McDonald, when hearing at least part of that story. I'm going to pass it on to Stacy here in just a minute. A lot of times when we have these events, people will say to me afterward, boy, that sure was great, but what could I do to help? Well, you can. Pictured behind me now is one of the Native American Speaks performances, in this case of Blackfeet dancers. performance, but every night in the park, there's the opportunity for visitors to hear these kinds of stories that Sally's talking about directly from Blackfeet, Salish, and Kootenai people in the park. More than 100 of them last year, zero of which will happen without private philanthropic support. The Glacier Conservancy funds the program. And so if you're motivated by wanting people to hear more of those stories, Andrew's going to put a link in the chat. It goes straight to a donate page. The $1 or $10 doesn't matter. Anything helps. And we'll be, I think, in the 43rd year of Native America Speaks next year, the longest running Indigenous speakers series in any national park in the country. So with that, Stacy, I'm going to hand it off to you. I know we've got a couple of more questions and we got giveaway winners. And I also wanted to note we have another author from our book club later this year. Ray Duff is with us. We're going to do Glacier Reds in July. Thanks for being with us, Ray.
All right. Hopefully my technology hangs in there. As Doug had mentioned earlier, we do have people from all over. It's great to see Rochester, Pittsburgh, Billings. And Sally, thanks so much for joining us. If people have questions, we have a few more minutes, so please put them in the chat. I'm going to go to a great question from Jean, who comments, so many thought-provoking chapters. On page 51, you talk about a Kootenai friend who discusses how mythic stories are trivialized and knowing became limited to the five senses. How can we best integrate and appreciate myth into our current state of existence?
Wow.
It's a good one.
Got some real deep thinkers out there. And I appreciate the question. I'm going to assume so many of you love the natural world. That's why you're here supporting Glacier. And the only thing that comes to me is like sitting by a stream and letting the bigger story inform you. I don't think we go after them somehow with our, let me see. Yeah, we have a little bit of time. This is a bit of an aside, but I think it's really important to the question and maybe to some things we all think about. I think ever since the written language, an actual alphabet, not pictographic language, but an alphabet was created, humans have become more and more abstract. I mean, think about the act of immediately knowing what a bunch of abstract symbols lined up in rows, that we know what that means. It's astonishing, right? It's so disconnected from the world. It's so abstract. And yet that's our main mode of living now. And the more time we spend there, the more left brain, analytical, rational we become, and disconnected from everything that just flows and that you sense more than think about. You feel, just when the air seems to change and you feel like, whoa, what was that? Or like the time I turned around on a trail when I was almost to my destination and I'm like arguing with myself, but why not? You want to go see that? It's an archaeological site at the end of this trail. But no, something deep in me said, turn around. And then, not far from there, where I had turned away from, I heard what had to have been a really big bear doing a big bark, and then saw the biggest pile of bear scat that I've ever seen on the road as I left that hadn't been there as I came in. And I just feel like something, but I didn't consciously smell anything or hear anything. It was, we just call them gut feelings, but that's the kind of sense that I think our progenitors had in spades. That was how you survived, because you developed those senses. And then out of that, you understand the bigger threads of life. That's all I have to say about it. I'd love to hear what you all think about that.
That was a beautiful and powerful answer, because I was reminded the other day, it was an epic sunset and someone remarked that their phone had died. And I was like, oh, that's such a disappointment. And they're like, no, that meant I had no distractions. I was enjoying the sunset. And I think so many of us put a lens or you're distracted. So thank you for sharing that. I think it's a good reminder to just sit and use all of our senses. Another follow-up question from Jean. Also, the Old North Trail is fascinating and something I knew nothing about. Are there any efforts underway to document it and value its place as a historical trail of significance?
Wow. An archaeologist who's since passed named Barney Reeves from Alberta had been hired by the park to do documentation of any existing evidence of the trail between, I think, north of Sun River and up to the border. And then I think he continued and did some in adjacent part of Alberta. But interestingly, I think because it crosses through so much private land, you know, anyway, the people out of Augusta have made an effort to put trail markers, large boulders that they've etched in just Old North Trail on. And so they're through the Old Trails Museum in in Shoto, sorry, that's all out of Shoto. They do tours and people can learn more through that vehicle. But yeah, wouldn't it be great if somehow that whole thing was preserved and kept unscathed?
Yeah. And Kay has a question. In the chapter about the Lewis and Clark Pass and Haystack Butte, I was astonished to learn the route still has sections to be discovered and documented. Is this common or just over the sections on private property? Over on private property such as the Steinbachs?
Well, I think when it's almost all of that is private property until you get up to the Badger to Medicine part of the forest, and then it's out at the edge and it's on Blackfeet Reservation. So a lot of it goes through the reservation. Some of it has been buried by currently used roads, but because of the drainages are all like the river systems are all running out of the mountains and toward the east there, right? And so there are so many tributaries transecting that landscape that to do modern engineering across it is difficult. So that's why, I-15 is way out from the mountains because you're finally out, to where there are fewer, it's just the big rivers and you don't have so many crossings. And so that in a way has been great, and it allowed these segments to continue. I don't know, and it was just such a funny fluke that story about me asking about the evidence, and it's the stuff people don't notice unless somehow you're trained to know what to look for.
Great.
But yeah, it's all
Thank
over.
you.
We've got some more questions if people want to put those in the chat. I had written myself a note on the same topic. You kind of leave that thread unsewn for us. Did Verna ever get you back on a horse to take you back out?
No, but it might not be too late. Yeah, I'd still love to do that. But that's an example of me just running on to the next thing, right? That was done and I had to move on to, and then just never feel like I have time to go back and enjoy, some of the great things that have come my way through this work.
Sally has been gracious enough to agree to sign book plates, which is awesome. If you'd like one, email info@glacier.org, info@glacier.org, and Sally and Gracie will make that happen. Thank you, Sally. It's very gracious. One of the great things about of having authors with us is being able to do this so that people around the country can have that in all of our books. So thank you for doing that. I also thought maybe you could give a little more insight. Those of us who are here, and my wife Julie actually worked at OPI on Indian Education for All. That's it. You talk about that in the book. That's a unique feature to Montana's 1973 Constitution. Maybe you could talk, since you worked on that, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that unique feature of our constitutional guarantee to Indian access for Indian education for all.
Well, I got to interview Earl Barlow some years ago, and he was one of the main instigators. He was Blackfeet and an educator, and he was one of many who approached the con about the importance of recognizing the native people here. And Montana is pretty unique in a lot of ways in that so many of the tribes here have been able to stay in their home territories. And because of our small population in general, that they make up a decent percentage and should not be neglected. And it was, those were back in the days when the governor's phone number was in the phone book, and you could just go knock on the door or call them up and they'd answer the phone. So it was kind of a different world, and people got along better. There's a lot more cross aisle efforts, successful efforts, and that was, I mean, what to say? 1972 and 3 were remarkable years for so much environmental conservation, for laws protecting so much that matters today. And I don't think it would ever happen again, or at least it's being dismantled, so many of those things now, and neglected. But Montana putting that in the state constitution influenced Washington state to do the same. I think Hawaii has also done that. And it's been a model for even some other nations to see that this can be legislated. But until Brian Schweitzer was governor, nobody funded it. And so that, there was such a surge then of creating good curriculum material. And yeah, it'd be great if there'd be another infusion. Because one thing I found, I worked in that field for about 10 years. So many of those teachers are gone. And the new batch, where do they learn if there's not another round of funding?
And that, again, the 1973 Constitution, a modern Constitution, has had some advantages in Montana. It's not the state you would put on the top of your list of who has the youngest Constitution. I don't think Montana would be on the top 5 guesses. But clean and healthful environment, that's where that comes from. Right to privacy, that's where that comes from. Quality free public education for every student, which includes Indian education for all. That's where that comes from. Earl Ballow's granddaughter is on our board now.
Oh, wonderful.
And we take this work and this educational work, particularly in the park with Native American Speaks and other programs, very seriously, because I think it's a part of that, right? That when a school field trip goes to the park, they should get that messaging. And I think thanks to, unfortunately, people had to sue to get that money for Brian Schweitzer then to appropriately.
Right.
But yeah, that's a great story. I also want to talk just briefly about, and we've got about 10 minutes left, about the work at the Badger 2. A very, and so I've shorthanded, and I apologize, the Badger 2 medicine area. That must have been you describe it as being a complicated assignment, right? But talk to us a little bit more about, how you strip away the layers of privilege here, right? That this is very complicated, that somehow now Native Americans who have had their land taken from them are having to prove that there's damage being done to their land. I mean, it's a very complicated thing. When you would go home at night and with your coworkers and your family and you were working through this, kind of what were the emotions, what were the complications like to think through that as you worked on that project?
Well, I subtitled that chapter Confessions of a Naive Anthropologist or Archaeologist. And I really feel shame when you bring it up of how naive I was and the cost to them, the potential cost. And I'm grateful that, people stuck with me to like hold my hand and say, it's kind of like what I was talking about earlier, how do you get to myth? You have to kind of shut up and start learning in a different way. And that's the magic of that, was how I changed because of what I was exposed to that allowed me to start thinking differently or experiencing differently, and then better able to represent, their experiences, because that's what I was supposed to be doing there, and not bringing my graduate school education to argue with them about what they believed. And then that story ending with the remarkable witnessing of a weatherman move a storm. If I wasn't a believer already, that summer changed things.
I'm so moved by the word you used, Shane, because that really has, I've felt the same thing in my life a number of times, including in this job, where I don't know what I don't know, and I get into an area where, and 2 hours later, I'm just like, look, you're 64 years old, you should know better. And so thank you, because I've felt the same thing. And it's okay. It doesn't mean we're bad people, right? It means we're educable. So and speaking of educable, I don't want to turn away from tonight other to give away two things. So Gracie, if you will give us our winners, then we're going to talk a little bit about one of the winners is going to get Black Robes Enter Coyote's World, which is Sally's new book that she's going to show us. And oh, look at that. And that's University of Nebraska, correct? Yeah. And so somebody's getting that, and then somebody's getting the Andy Garcia 1967 book, Trip Through Paradise. And so Gracie, do you have those winners?
Yes, yeah, I do. Thanks, Doug. Our winners tonight are going to be Maureen Moriarty and then Zach Zipfel, which is maybe Zach and Darby. So just email info@glacier.org and then I'll arrange the shipping of your giveaway prizes. Congrats.
Awesome. So Sally, tell us a little more about the book.
About Black Robes. 10 years in the making. It was a long process, a lot of wandering around, and much of what I learned I didn't include in the book ultimately, but it informed me and my ability to write this book in a way that tells a story that really hasn't been known. The subtitle is Chief Charlot and Father De Smet in the Rocky Mountains. And I think the story of Chief Victor and Charlot of the Bitterroot Salish is one that really should be known, but for reasons that you can imagine, Americans have been drawn to the warrior cultures. We look at the number of books on Lakota war chiefs or Geronimo or, Blackfeet. There have been hundreds and hundreds of books on the Blackfeet, and virtually nothing on the Salish except a book that they published themselves during the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. And they were diplomats. They were peacemakers. They were generous people, and they still are. And they are models that, continue to set high bars. Like Salish Kootenai College is considered the premier tribal college in the nation and has influenced education all over indigenous world. And they had the first tribal wilderness, and they're leaders and always have been, but from a whole different point of view than what most people read about in terms of plains or mountain Indians. And so that's the story I ended up telling, the relationship through the lifetime of De Smet and Charlot. And so you can kind of tell the whole history, the Iroquois fur trade and the missionaries, and on up through the treaty makers, and then the lack of follow through with the treaty, and how Charlot's people finally had to move because they were starving to death because everything had been taken from them. So it felt like the book I came to write, and I'm exhausted and thrilled to have it done and to have nothing in my mind anymore. It's like no new book trying to find its way out. I need a rest, but yeah, I'm thrilled to have it out, and especially the endorsement on the cover from Johnny R. Lee, Bitterroot Salish spiritual leader, just means the world to me that he's so thrilled to have it out there, and so it feels good. Yeah.
2 books. In 1 year, James Patterson's got nothing on you. So
Oh yeah. Well, don't expect any more is the difference.
use the note. Don't ever give Doug Mitchell 2 minutes, because with 2 minutes, I can in fact and should launch a quick set of yes or no questions. We always have this speed round in a book club. So here you go. You spend a lot of time outside, so your choice is gloves or mittens.
Mittens.
Mittens. Okay. So you spend a lot of time outside, so you have gear. As Chenard says, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear. So do you go Patagonia or North Face?
I got whatever I can find in the used store.
I will accept that answer. That's the best one. Okay, so ski bum. We're going to go back to ski bum. Groomers or moguls?
Well, it used to be moguls. It's moved to groomers. Yeah.
Okay, I like it. You've put in a few miles around the state, some on dirt roads. So Toyota or Subaru?
Well, I drive a VW now, but I've had both Toyotas, Subarus, and now I'm a VW.
VW. Okay, all electric.
No.
Okay, so last but not least, back to the ski bum. Big mountain or big sky?
Oh, geez. Snowball. I can't help it.
Okay, very good. I like that. Nothing like a good local mountain. You'll note big mountain. There'll always be big mountain to me.
I can't afford the other ones anymore. So, Snowball, Discovery, yeah.
There you go. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The amazing Sally Thompson. Two books in 1 year. What an amazing way to start off the 2025 Glacier Book Club. Our next book club, a great guest, Diane Boyd, the woman living with women with wolves, woman living with wolves. I'm forgetting the title off the top of my head. She's the Jane Goodall of wolves. In fact, Jane Goodall writes a piece on her book cover. So she'll be our next book club, and then I have a Glacier Conversation coming up just in a couple of weeks with North Face athletes who talk about their story, helping photograph annual photograph of glaciers. So thanks again, Sally, for being with us. It's just an absolute
Great.
and
Thank you.
for such a great advocate for the park and its first people. Everybody, have a great night. Thanks so much, and we'll see you on the trail soon. Take care. Good night.
Sounds good. Good.